Now, I hope you are as stoked as I am, excited. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce to you one of the first keynote speakers, Crina Damsa, who will be speaking on Together for Learning, Understanding the Ecosystems of Collaborative Learning. Crina Damsa has studied linguistics and Romanian language and literature at the Norway University in Romania, then went on for a Master of Education Sciences at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, and worked her way further up north for a dissertation on knowledge co-construction and object-oriented collaboration at the University of Oslo in Norway, where she's now an associate professor and a vice dean for innovation and digitalization at the Faculty of Educational Science. She is also been a visiting scholar in Utrecht, Helsinki, and Sydney, keeping up those ties, international ties. Crina has been incredibly successful in acquiring funds and in publishing, with a total of 67 peer-reviewed publications, is tremendously active community services in government of marketing the scientific communities, especially of ISLS and EARLI, taking up community services, a review also in 21 journals, and of course multiple conferences as well. This is not her first rodeo. She has been a keynote speaker multiple times at SIG conferences, so I'm guessing this is her biggest rodeo. Very excited. Her field of interest, she's interested in broader learning ecologies and evolving individual processes and their interaction with others, resources, contexts, and technologies. Crina investigates socio-cultural and technological aspects of learning in formal and informal settings. Her overall research focus is in the areas of collaborative learning and learning and interaction, contemporary conceptualizations of learning and methodological development, learning design and interdisciplinary learning, and digital technologies in teaching and learning. Please give a big hand for applause. A warm welcome to Crina Damsa.
Thank you, Armin, for this very kind introduction. It's a very cool one. And for the invitation to deliver this keynote. In the next minutes, I invite you to reflect together with me on a set of conceptual and methodological methods, and as I discuss a topic that has triggered my research interest over the past decade, collaborative learning. More concretely, I will discuss ways to explore collaborative learning and beyond understanding of distinct elements or outcomes by proposing the methodological framework as a lens for interpretation. The empirical illustrations I will be using today are based on research on small group collaboration, and mostly in a higher education context, and that's the main area of research. I will be reading a little because, this is a confession, I'm exploring a new topic today, or a slightly new terrain, so I felt more sort of reassured having some text in front of me, but also I promise some empirical illustrations, which and hope will ease a little the listening to some theoretic content. So, this perhaps I would ready. It is perhaps a little early for TV show entertainment, but still, I would like to invite you to watch a brief video clip together with me. And as you watch, see if you can identify some elements of collaboration. I spoiled the surprise here, but there you go. So I invite you to recall what elements of collaboration in EPSI. We're not going to do a Q&A right now, we're reserved to it later. But I will show you what I saw in this very short sequence. I saw the doctor identifying the medical problem, threatening the patient's life, sharing of medical information, and use of medical instruments, coordination of tasks, and more. A dynamic combination of cooperative elements. So this was a dramatized example of a high-fidelity collaborative situation in a medical context. But we know that elements of collaboration appearing in this example are generic and present in other disciplines and professions. Collaboration is not today more than ever, perhaps, very important to learn collaborative skills as we need to engage grand challenges, as it was mentioned in yesterday's opening ceremony, where individual solutions might not be sufficient. But collaborative situations also hold a tremendous potential for learning. It is not only the learning of collaborative skills, but also of your knowledge and critical work with knowledge, ways of acting, and ways of thinking. In the past 2-3 decades, extensive and high-quality research in the field of learning and instruction has generated a vast amount of knowledge about collaborative learning, especially in education context. Its very short list of selected references only shows a glimpse of the extensive work, for example, on how structured guidance supports collaboration, how groups solve problems or manage tasks, and how argumentative, I'll explain what that to say later, how argumentative dialogue unfolds during classmates' discussions, or how emotions are expressed verbally. This research has led us to acknowledge the various dimensions of learning, the cognitive, social, proactive, and the fact that collaborative learning then takes very many forms. From short-lived term interactions to reading well-defined, that was a little fast, during well-defined structured group tasks to long-term collaboration work on goal-ended problems or projects. So what remains to be said about collaborative learning then? What I have learned from the existing research on my own explanations is that collaboration is complex, dynamic, and often very messy. While we may have gained very refined empirical knowledge of distinct elements of collaboration, we might still be lacking integrated interpretations of collaborative learning processes. For example, are we fully able to account for the way a group of school children reason together about a task, use lesser resources, write up ideas on a laptop, coordinating talks, or does something, while still being nice to each other? And can we capture the way their interactions are productive or not, and whether they may be in need of guidance? So examining the output of group work or snapshots of the collaborative process has proven that I would claim insufficient, especially when we want to understand how learning opportunities are materialized during the period of a task, a project, or an entire course, and how multiple individual backgrounds and motivations, disciplinary domains, and physical, digital, and social resources are blended into a collaborative learning activity. This is a part in our research that requires further work and exploration. I take up this exploration and suggest that in order for us to capture the collaborative learning in its complexity, we need to employ an ecological lens for interpretation. And in the following, I will be collaborating on this. I will be discussing how we could conceptualize collaborative learning from an ecological perspective. So I will synthesize some theoretical ideas and converge towards elaborating on how this may be instrumental on our research on collaboration. I will then discuss how empirical examination of collaborative learning can account for its ecosystemic complexity. As I said, I will provide some empirical examples from previous and ongoing work, illustrating how we grapple at the moment with applying ecological notions in qualitative and mixed method research on collaborative learning. And finally, I will discuss briefly the challenges and opportunities that we work on using an ecological method for the same goal in the research and practice of collaborative learning. So moving on into the first part of the discussion, I am proposing an ecosystem metaphor, and I emphasize a metaphor, as a way to account for the complex and dynamic nature of collaborative learning, and an ecological perspective on collaboration as a framework for interpretation, in a way that may be generative for our research. In environmental sciences, where this metaphor scores from, ecology is defined as the study of the relationship between living organisms and their environments as they interact within their ecosystems. Ecosystems have two defining characteristics. First, they are multi-layered and composed of organisms and populations, each with specific traits, developed through their life history. The simplest example, we can all think a lake, an ecosystem in a lake, where with all the life forms living together, but also thinking of their evolution history. Second, dynamic interactions between these organisms sustain the ecosystem. Such developments are inseparable from the development of its individual elements and are influenced by their relationships. Landforms in the lake interact, and changes in one life form brings changes into the ecosystem. I would claim that learning systems have many similar features to environmental systems. They are multi-layered, from hypothesis at the level of individual cognition to motivational traits of learners, to collective level of learning communities, disciplines, and education institutions. And they are managed by relationships between these interacting elements within and across these layers. A group of students learning are part of a school context where a curriculum is taught. Particular teaching methods are being used, and other student groups are engaging in the same work. But these students have also their own social lives, interests, family context, various expectations, and motivations for collaboration, as well as varying prior knowledge and competencies. There are several ecological theories, not just one, that are used to describe human development and learning by describing the constitutive elements and how they function. These descriptions place the emphasis on either on the person, on relations, and on communities. And I'll be moving forward and describing briefly this different emphasis. A person-focused ecological model, such as Prof. model of human development, place the entire focus on individuals' cognitive activities, but not in the isolation from the environment. Contemporary theories of distributed cognition, for example, by Hutchins, highlight how higher levels of anxious cognitive processes such as thinking or problem solving are intertwined with material surroundings. These perspectives move away from viewing learning and cognition as property of an isolated human mind towards studying patterns of interaction between mental activities, embodied action, and the resources in the environment. And I'm summarizing that for you before I move on to the relation corpus model, which have examples with cultural, social material, and cultural historical approaches to learning, connecting back to Vygotsky's social-cultural psychology and Reid's ecological realism. And the references you will find at the end of the presentation, so no worries. The focus is on the knowledge and science in a sociocultural perspective. Language, knowledge representations, such as the figures that I'm showing today, objects, tools, mediate interactions between learners and help them in their collective meaning-making processes. Meaning-making is a concept that can also be considered in understanding. Finally, community-focused models emphasize the learning of collectives in organizations or informally emerging communities, like this. Activity systems or networks are apologies, and the environment activity systems or networks are examples of frameworks that help explain such configurations, cognitive and the environments of larger collectives, and how sustained interaction is essential for this. So before moving on, I will take a sip of water and I will let you figure out this one.
Let me see that. It's
This is how I conceptualize collaborative learning from an ecological perspective. In conceptualize collaborative learning in this way, it may involve irregular trajectories and intersection points during collaboration element of each of these ecological notions that I just mentioned blend into one. Accordingly, cognitive theories that account for individual learner thinking and listening are required. But it is both the theorizing of processes and of distributing cognition that feed into an ecological notion of collaboration. Theoretical notion describing how individuals relate to each other and to the environment during collaborative encounters are essential, as collaboration is fundamentally relational. Theories at the level of organization and collective learning may help explain the connections to sets of resources available in broader environments and developed historically within a society, within the education system, within a knowledge discipline, knowledge domain. You might wonder how it is even possible to consider studying such a mesh of elements, layers, and trajectories, and it is a justified question. One crucial instrumental notion that I suppose and I suggest can help untangle this complexity is the unit of analysis. And I suggest that to capture the collaborative learning of these systems, we must base interpretations on applicability analysis. Unit of analysis can be seen as, and I'll briefly render into an explanation, as a meaningful set of ideas that synthesize the research problem, periodical phenomenon one studies. In deciding on what the unit of analysis will be, theory is rewarded, but theory can also be directed. So according to Roque and Sadio, the point of a theory, when deciding on the unit of analysis, does not lie in its correspondence with the world, but rather in an explanatory power to a set of issues. Something, and this underlines the point that we might need different theoretical frameworks in order to explain some of the phenomena we study, which is the argument my claim today. In a series of studies about unit of analysis in learning research, my collaborator Alfredo Crina and I argue that the unit of analysis must be adapted to the specific research problem. In an ecological framework, this would always represent an integration of several elements and their relationships. While theory can provide premises and direction in identifying the unit of analysis, it is not given or predefined based on theoretical premises only. Identifying the unit of analysis may require a dynamic process, going back and forth between theory and insights gained through initial observations of the phenomenon. I will briefly return to the typology of the various ecological models, which can help us provide us with some fundamentals on identifying an ecological unit of analysis. So in the first focused ecological model, if you recall, the unit of analysis is still the individual, but individual cognitive processes that are expanded to include external resources that involve in their cognitive activities. Further, studied how the body and mind are coupled with multiple elements in the environment require focus on different modalities through which the learning activities are taking place. This can be speech, gestures, when others, teachers or peers are involved in supporting learning, or manipulation of materials and artifacts, the task, the syllabus, the digital platforms students are on, when it is non-human surroundings, which usually is involved in collaboration, rather than just thinking, reasoning for isolated emotion. In the relation focus model, the unit of analysis is at the level of interactional encounters, verbal or non-verbal, between individual learners or the contents they work with, various tools, physical, digital, or intellectual, that enable that interaction, or sometimes hinder it. Technology for online connectivity is an illustrative example in this case. For collaborative learning, the direct interaction mechanisms, talk, joint attention, focus, nonverbal communication, but also the underlying actions that regulate participation and quality of interaction and contribute to a task or problem are essential. In the validity focus model, the basic unit of analysis are the ways network and communities interact and function, and how they construct the structures and knowledge that eventually become used for further learning of individuals, groups, or collectives. A unit of analysis for researching collaborative learning from an ecological perspective would have to capture not only distinct elements of collaboration, but also the processes and tools that enable or hinder it, and the context in which it happens. In Vygotsky's words, the unit of analysis must, I quote, designate the product of analysis that poses all the basic characteristics of the whole. Not least, as Alfredo and I claimed, an ecological unit of analysis for collaborative learning must move beyond the individual social dichotomy and account for both the epistemological and ontological dimensions of learning. Individual learners, as I already stated, come together to work on joint tasks. When they do, they bring with them both individual traits, knowledge, and skills to learn throughout their life history, in school or otherwise, and there to use a notion, life worlds, which shape both their knowledge and experiences of the world. It is inevitable that these multiple individual layers intersect, hence the intersecting lines on the previous slide, and interact at community or at the relational level while attending to joint tasks or problem on a time scale that can range from a few minutes to months. There are different notions in the literature, and I'll be elaborating on this, but I think it's important to mention that refer to this blending of cognitions and subjectivities, such as Rochelle and Tisley's shared problem space, Walsinger's notion of intellectual interdependence, and Matusoff's concept of intersubjectivity. This can be instrumental when trying to untangle and interpret interaction processes, and collaborative work that is rather a joint effort rather than a simple collection of individual inputs, and more than only solving a problem or fulfilling a task. Finally, this interaction never takes place in a vacuum, but most often in organized context of a class or course, where pedagogical tools and knowledge artifacts developed historically, like books, databases, devices, that the premises for the chapter process. So if we are to summarize this relatively intricate elaboration, the main features of an ecological unit of analysis, in the way I envision it for today, it might become more refined or more elaborated tomorrow. It should contain elements, and I list here examples in three very essential categories: individual cognitions, traits, skills, backgrounds, lived experience, affect, and so on. Everything that characterizes an individual profiles or background. The knowledge that is being operated with and interacted with by participants. Objects, tools, and language, which are mediating this, the relations and interactions. So interactions would be reflective of the relational aspect, and it's usually the element that we always try to identify when we studied collaborative processes. Interactions can be verbal with other participants or non-verbal with others, contents, objects, tools. In social cultural theories, these are also considered interactions. I emphasize that collaboration evolves over multiple timescales. It can be different timescales, and it is important to capture those, rather than just capturing snapshot for collaboration. And I as well emphasize that the transactional relationship with the environment, which is, as explained, the environment can take many forms: cultural, material, intellectual, and so on, a disciplinary domain. Groups of students or learners placed in these environments always interact by accessing resources, but also placing back ideas, knowledge, products into this environment. It might change as well. So before moving on, I would ask you to perhaps take a moment to think about your own research, or the research that you might be planning after this conference. I think whether you use explicitly or implicitly ecological notions, such as some of those listed before, to interpret the phenomenon we studied. Which were this, and what was it that you were studying? And I guess keywords are sufficient. This is the link to Mentimeter and the code, and I think Rachel already activated it. The link and the code, and I will move on, as I have to stick to time, to provide some narrative examinations and sort of like exploration, but examples, I propose, of collaborative learning with attempts of basically accounting for ecosystemic complexity. And I emphasize again, some of these illustrations are from my previous work and work with collaborators, and it's primarily qualitative research. I was still in a phase when trying to understand collaboration in its complexity in a qualitative fashion, and some of the work is actually from ongoing work with my project partners and project team. So when discussing collaboration, I mentioned these dimensions. Based on my conceptualizations of collaboration, I outline these dimensions in a different way. I emphasize this epistemic dimension, which for me includes the cognitive activities, but also the knowledge that those cognitive activities sort of encompass. The regulative dimension is sort of corresponding to metacognitive activities from the traditional dimensions, and social relational I basically put together in one category. This is for analytical purposes, obviously, and this is was basically at the beginning of my empirical explorations. So I would be mentioning a few projects, but generally the overarching empirical focus in these projects was how students create knowledge to solve problems in collaboration in small groups most of the time. So distinct elements that I focused on were production interactions in collaborative groups, and I really pursued in my analysis aspects that were indicative of productive interaction, not in a normative sense, but in a way that showed how interactions actually generate potential for learning or actually trigger learning. In addition, I was very interested in how objects, such as tools or developing artifacts, which I'll be showing some examples of immediately, mediate these interactions. So it wasn't just a talk, it was also what groups actually did during their interaction concretely. And I was interested in how the students actually experience being part of this process. So here are 3 examples, and I will be spending a lot of time on the empirical context, but these are examples from teacher education, software engineering, and media and design engineering. And you have examples of groups of students sitting either in classrooms with analog tools and technology in front of them, and usually working on an object, an artifact, a knowledge artifact, as I called it in my thesis. In this case, it's teacher education, doing literature reviews and creating a report and a solution for schools on assessment methods and instruments in environmental vocational education, as an example. This was a project that spanned 12 weeks. In software engineering, I followed groups that produced or learned to program websites. Again, the project spanning 3 months. This is from a larger project funded by the Norwegian Research Council together with other collaborators. And this is a project or a research study in media and design education, where lots of project students in the same lesson were learning to design digital libraries, how to store several documents, multimedia documents, and products. So this is a typical data set. As an illustration of a typical data set we would collect in our projects in order to, as we say traditionally, ensure triangulation, that we have information about the phenomenon, the interaction, and the work mediating interaction actually, from different angles. Verbal data, the objects and artifacts developed, self-reports on experiences, and always secondary data, obviously, that gave us the possibility to create thick description and actually understand the context in which all these groups were always working. So I will be briefly just illustrating at a very much space the way I try to basically, if not bring in or try to unveil all the elements of an ecological analysis, at least some of them. So in this case, I looked at interaction, how students work with knowledge. And what you see here are 4 categories from my coding schemes, where I was trying to see how students would engage with a problem, try to gain shared understanding of the problem by sharing or asking for knowledge, but also, and more importantly, how they would actually generate knowledge themselves based on those understandings. Concurrently, and this is based on, as I said, extensive research in the field, I was also looking at how in parallel development process regulative actions are unfolding in order to keep that collaboration going. And I have here a very short excerpt, and I promise it's the only one that I show today. This is the type of data that we work a lot with in qualitative research and analysis of interaction, where I marked in those colors the type of utterances or statements that would correspond to that category. And now, I don't know if I really saw it out loud for you. So these are 3 students in teacher education working on feedback, so that creating assessment instruments and guidelines for teachers to give good feedback. They were actually talking about a point or a section in their report. When I read your feedback, Jesus, I thought, which difference do you mean? I can try to imagine some positive analysis and paper books. But in this analysis, it's important to emphasize the differences in relation to the practical context. Yes, these are different notions, validity and authenticity. The way you dealt with that, this might need some more elaboration. Yes, I focused on the aspects we discussed, but what are your points? The connection with the domain and how the relationships can be explained with that context, within that context of environmental education, for example. I have a suggestion for that. Will you write it down, or shall I? Right, go on. So you see here, and it's quite straightforward, how students engage in, first of all, providing feedback on content, but also, while doing that, they elaborate on the concepts and ideas that were, and in this case, the concepts that were actually at focus of the discussion. But also, they take care of regulating the task work, the work on task, where ad is actually making sure that that is being noted down in order to be taken out further. So I'm moving on here, and I'll be jumping from category to category to give a very, very quick example on how work with knowledge in groups, and this is from the media and design education project, are actually intertwined with more social relational aspects and the broader, for the larger ecosystems of and life flows of students. In this case, I look at how the example is on how students actually manage to gain the type of knowledge that they missed in order to solve the solution. So the students were international students. They were living in the country where they were studying for a long time, but they did manage to connect their ethnic community. And interestingly enough, and I'm going to try to use this expensive pointer. You see here the group 1. And they interacted also with other groups. They asked advice from their teacher, but what they reported in social network analysis measurements that we applied in order to find out whom they interact with whom and how often, they thought that they actually interacted with their ethnic community. That's where they found advice, asked for advice on both the problem but also how to deal with academic life in the countries where they were studying. So this kind of shows that the small micro-level ecosystem of the group actually has been expanded to a larger epistemic social network system. And I will provide some illustrations about how interaction at interactional level, how interaction actually could be productive for working on knowledge objects, which were in all the studies that we conducted at the center of our analytical exploration. So I'm diving here into this category of generative collaborative actions, which in that particular type of interaction where objects were in focus, it manifested in uptake of ideas and concepts from one moment of interaction to another, and development of artifacts through verbal interaction. And I'll provide some example of artifacts and objects because I keep talking about them. So in the software engineering project, and I'm using here a categorization from the social technical perspectives and sociology of knowledge based on Prof. We have technical objects. These can be objects, physical objects such as laptops, but also digital objects such as learning management platforms. boundary objects. This is a Stack Overflow. This is the resource that many students use, and it's created by professionals. And it's a boundary object because students use it to tap into resources from the professional disciplinary domain. And this is what we could call an extent object. This is what the students were working on. So these are the type of objects that I explored, or the interactions that I explored to this object during this, the work during this analysis. And here possibly the order of this slide is not ideal, but we also looked into how concepts, such as the feedback concept that I pointed out in that sequence of interaction, are mediating, can actually be mediators of interaction, but also help and evolve during the collaboration. So what you see here in the first quadrant is concepts that were discussed by the group in the first weeks of their activity or their collaboration. In the middle, you see a more refined list. They're starting to understand these concepts by discussing them. Some were sent out, and some were dropped, and some were brought in, some new ones. And here you see a final list of objects or of concepts that they worked on. So this shows how through these lessons, and through, in our case, analytical perspective, through following the interactions sequentially and temporally, we could actually trace how interaction helped students to actually work in an object-oriented manner. So this is basically an illustration of what I just said. We are very much used to actually analyze interactions, at least in studies from that where we use social cultural perspective. So we look at how interaction unfolds in time, but what we've tried to do was to actually identify actions from that interactions that led to a development of those objects, which, as reported by students and based on our assessment, scoring of the interaction and objects, led to learning outcome for the students. So basically, in the analysis, I've both captured the unfolding of the interaction, but also how those interactions can be productive. Here's an aggregated overview, which I will, I guess I will not insist too much, basically showing how we summarized different types of interactions, epistemic actions, as they were quoting, as a simple level or near level of verbal interaction, but also how this idea uptake and concept uptake has happened in different groups, and how that led to more or less elaborated objects, which were in a simple analysis has shown that it correlates with actually the final grade as a student. And in the following, I am showing what may seem a very complicated figure, but in essence it's not. It's basically summarizing everything that I said until now. Here you see two groups, and I would invite you to guess which was one of the successful groups and which was not. And group A, what I'm showing now basically is all these elements that we accounted for while analyzing interaction. Those are ideas and concepts mentioned during the collaboration or the discussion. What you see further is, and we have to look on this side, is how those were actually taken up in drafts, either individual drafts or collective drafts. What you see on the lower line is actually the number of meetings where all these were actually taken off and discussed, and where in the middle you see the shared artifact. So you see a lot of continuity. The lines indicate continuity. The fact that an idea was discussed and we could see it, trace it in an object, in a draft or a shared version of the report later on. And these little check boxes are moments feed. You can see that in group B, there are missing lines. There are very few lines which indicate that the uptake of ideas was not the trick. So I'll bring this to a closure, this example at least. What I've been attempting in my previous work was to capture elements of collaboration, whether interactions, object-oriented interaction, regulative actions, and also social relational elements, such as the one in the media education, trying to put together all these bricks and elements that might form an ecology of collaborative learning in the way that I studied. But in the recent years, and also with the rise of the new technologies, the research on the collaborative learning has been evolving, and there is a proposal which I'm not necessarily supporting, but I think it's a very interesting opportunity for us to actually understand even more of the elements of collaboration. There's a proposal for a behavioral dimension, which has always been there, but in a way it has been hidden. The new technologies are helping us to explore it in a different way. Until now, for instance, interaction with objects, as I showed, could be studied the way I did it, manually actually following all those concepts and ideas in different documents. Through observations. Attention focus could be observed on videos through video copying. Emotions to self-reports has been done for a long time. Movement of, let's say, embodied interaction and collaboration through observations. But technologies, and we know that there is already a field out there that is moving this understanding and this work forward. It's bringing in new data forms and new possibilities that allow us to actually explore what we could call this more hidden behavioral aspects. And of course, neurological and neurological measures are also an example. So I am entering actually a small discussion about modalities, because this idea of modalities is coming into play because we are collecting so many different data types and technologically enhanced data types as well. And this is a figure created by Rashad Esterhazy and a number of projects I am in currently. And what we try to emphasize is here is both show different modalities, as quiz and see, I guess, visual modalities, auditory, kinesthetic, tactile, and physiological. But also the fact that modality, it doesn't mean a data type. A particular modality, such as the visual one, provides us with a lot of different types of data. Video is very rich data. And this is what we're actually capitalizing on in our current research. So in a sense, the discussion between on modality and triangulation is a very relevant one. We found, and Michelle is actually presenting a review study on this work. We found a lot of misconceptions and confusions, people confusing modality with data. So I invited to actually attend this session because it's a very interesting discussion. That's basically a bit of a background in it. But I'll be moving on in giving my last illustration on current work, and I've emphasized this is ongoing work, which is from a project on teamwork analytics for training collaborative problem solving in professional higher education in 3 domains: legal education, medical education, and nursing and education. Large projects funded by the Research Council of Norway with many collaborators, Norwegian and international. And what we focus on here is on trying to understand the various association of collaboration and how we can use analytics as a source of data for providing adaptive feedback. In essence, we thought when applied for this funding, it would be dashboards, but we are learning a lot on the way, and we know that probably this will evolve into something else. So I'll provide a little more entertainment, but this is actually research data. So this is just to give you a sense of how our data looks like. At least in nursing education, we are in an intensive year high-fidelity simulation lab. And you see these 2 students were actually playing the roles of nurses. They're advanced students in their first master year. Actually helping Noral. Noral has been in an accident, and she is in a critical condition. So let me see if my video works. We have 12 more stats. And then the air is of pronouncing name. En maar det här var två typ skrivningar av världen. Och inte den kapillärde så att det här kan jag bli en smakare. Ja, men det är ju. Ja, den slapp direkt på en av det. Men det är att för det diskussion på det där. Det måste att det smakar på det så är det inte där. Ja, en smule växtväck kan sätta ner. Det var men när det var så det var plus det var där han inte ser man en när det den så där. Den där fortsätter det med att det sen ligger det står det kommer att för summit a cancel på pump men jag har på sig och vi hade det president kapinat city. Men då vet vi vad det är så det går för det går när slags statement don't squat ball det att de borde ha det var i July yesterday and don't yeah I got him a business as an yeah posting det där efter att få så den så på den måste på men det ska väl ha det spel rather with that that's all it vad har det pickat ut snabbt så ska vi se det är det några en mycket det några every bad I did this för några jag miste beviset där så att kanske du får komma med sängen så det går till lägen.
Hello, I'm back. So what you've seen there on Renal Fast, what you've seen there is a sequence of interaction or a collaboration, an intervention that kind of captures a lot of elements of what a team of nurses actually needs to engage in. And in this particular exploratory iteration, we collected audio data, video data, observations, and debriefing data on debriefings and interview descriptions. In the next iteration, we intend to actually continue gathering those analytics, as I indicated, physiological data, for example, on heart rate and breathing rate, in order to actually also try to capture students' stress levels, because in the last part of this sequence, you could see certain elements of indicating increased stress level. And I'm going to show patient simulation data or log data. I'm going to get to this. This is just to reiterate the type of data that we either collected or will be collected. And please note on the lower side here, modality, the source, and here the type of data that we are collecting. So visual data, audio data streams, which would be different, interesting. It's complicated relatively technically to get data from multiple participants. Physiological measures, as I mentioned, system logs on generated by systems, and reflection data from the debriefing session, where students are actually in a guided fashion reflect on elements of the stimulation. The guidance is provided for now, but if there is in a completely qualitative approach, open questions on how to experience the simulation. So here we are interacting with the teachers. But what we did, in order to try to map very quickly for this talk today, we coded very quickly video sequences and audio sequences in trying to actually capture some this multimodality. So using a coding scheme which we applied, or which with elements of epistemic work, for example, knowledge sharing, talk about tasks, but also recognitive ones. So in this particular type, you see task coordination. The nurses, if you recall, there's one that shall we see if we can get to something. You know, she's assigning nurse to a task. Nurse 2 was also handling patients, so that's embodied action. When situations that become critical, we see nurse 1 changing intonation. The speed of her talk is increasing, and she changes intonation. But also, we see eye contact, which at this moment we code based on video analysis, but we are aiming at actually collecting eye gaze to have a more systematic overview of joint attention focus in this case. So just one brief example to continue here to show also information sharing. So next one is actually verbalizing, communicate to the student as one, I'm losing consciousness, which is obviously the patient's consciousness. She's handling the patient at the same time. She's watching the screen, so she's bringing in technologies, tools that provide her information about the critical situation. There's a change in intonation and a change in speech rate. And NEM2 is also bringing in the medical instrument. So we have physical manipulation objects. So Armin is indicating 5 minutes, but I will ask for 10. Thanks. Thank you. And this is a complicated section because we can have an endless list of challenges. What we did when discussing with my colleagues about this talk is that there are also these challenges can be turned into opportunities, and try to see whether at least you can learn how such an ecological framework can be applied on the type of data that we collect on collaboration, but also to inform educational practice, the practice of collaborative learning and the guidance of collaborative learning. So I listed here just a few challenges that I will elaborate on briefly in the time that I still have. And it's about articulating this ecological unit of analysis, because despite all the theoretical ideas I put together, I know that this is a thorny challenge. And also how do we create integrated analytical accounts of all these data streams that we bring in? It's not just a technical challenge, but it's also an interpretative challenge. So I'll just show a brief illustration how we started to actually make sense of that. One other aspect, and I put appropriate research design in the middle, because we try to take a research-based approach in our when we enter the educational context that we are examining. So we are introducing designs that generate data that could be also informative for the teachers and help them in creating these adaptive learning designs and guidance for the groups. And our phone is called that. But to return to the first point on the unit analysis, and I think I need to warn you, don't read the details. It's about the overarching structure and actually the process, the way we try to do this in an abductive fashion, meaning that we are examining theory, see which constructs and analytical categories are out there that could help us in understanding what should we actually study in this particular collaborative setting, but at the same time collecting data and informing the decisions we make both by empirical insight and theoretical insights. So to make the process simpler, we decided in the case of the nursing example that the unit of analysis is knowledge upon joint action. These students need to know what they're doing, but they also have to actually continuously inform each other, act together, and understand each other. So the data types and modalities are the ones that I just showed, so we don't need to go into that. And then we identify observable expression of behavior. There's a missing word there. I call that sharing information, assigning tasks, changing speech. This can be observed. In this case on the video, when we'll have different data types, we can actually probably add them more systematically. But on the other side of the theory, and I think I will just click through so you have the entire picture. On the other side of the theory, we have analytical constructs that are theory-related. Joint attention focus is telling something, or it helps us interpret eye contact. If we just observe eye contact, it could indicate very many different things, but we know that joint attention focus means that the participants in the interaction are actually focusing on the same, either in the same situation, or the same problem, or possibly on the same, ready for the same action, or joint action. I should be using this pointer a little more actively. When it comes to the constructs, this is a relatively more higher level of abstraction, where we can bring in concepts from the literature in order to actually make some inferences or theoretical explanations, such as regulation of teamwork, dialogical meaning making, self-management, coming from different theories. And I listed here just as examples where this particular theoretical constructs come from, which theoretical areas. And then we see that we need theoretical sources and theoretical perspectives that allow us to actually interpret all the type of actions that are happening in such a small, short sequence of collaboration. So for the sake of time, I'll be rushing a little through this part, where I am just reiterating, this is not new information, how, for example, collaborative learning analytics that I've been sort of illustrating briefly at the end, can be used and supported in collaborative practice through the means of research. There's been already evidence that analytics presented in a certain way, so data that is processed appropriately, can create awareness of correlation. I'll show a brief example immediately, shortly. Helping groups to alter their collaborative strategies, so through reflection, and that could be a form of adaptive feedback. Supporting teachers in guiding collaborative groups. So, for example, by identifying notes at traces. The way we, as I mentioned, we try to use a research-based approach, and in our research, the research design fundamental elements are those of design-based research. And you see here a very simple, in case you're not familiar, set of phases of research-based design, where we engage in the first phase, an exploratory one, which I just presented from the team of project, an exploration of a situation in order to grasp the main problems that we need to continue studying. Through that process and through analysis of the data and informed also by theory, we design an intervention. Often is it in collaboration with the teachers. Once the intervention is applied, we could collect also reflections on how the intervention went about, in addition to all the data types that inform about different elements of collaboration. In our studies, we use view rhetorical interviews or briefing discussions. And then the evaluation in this particular research design approach was basically analyzing and obtaining results that can feed back into a new iteration. And I'm presenting this because this is how we are accounting in a way for all the complexities of the collaborative situation that we are studying in team learning in different domains, knowing that we need to develop a baseline on which we keep adding understanding of different elements, of different relationships, by going into the field in different iterations and collecting different complementary views, as in accounting for that complexity and the ecosystemic nature of those situations. So here it's simple for illustration to illustrate that type of design-based approach, both on a shorter time span. Simulations in this particular case are 90 minutes in total. We see how the structure of the scenario, briefing, simulation, debriefing, simulation, and debriefing again. And here data that we are collecting and intend to use in order to inform both students and teachers on different elements of their collaboration, and most likely on breakdowns or more vulnerable moments are presented in the debriefing. So we see here, as I said, short time span collaborative situation. And I am showing briefly, doing justice to the work done by our collaborators in the team learn project from Monash University, Roberto Martinez Maldonado and his team. A type of simulation and analytical work that actually allows us to look into the temporality, into the details of that collaborative sequence, but going into an integrative approach, which we are actually striving for. So again, you don't need to look at the details, but what you see here are the different participants in the nursing team. There are several, and here you see different measures of collect from either from the participant or from the mannequin. And what the Monash team is doing in this particular case, they are feeding back this data in the debriefing sessions to teachers and students in order to actually trigger a reflection on aspects of collaboration that they consider important. So here you can see a way of signaling something that the group has done positively. In the second part, you can see ways of actually using medical materials and actually using medical knowledge to treat the patient. Positive feedback as well, but also indications of what the students have not performed, whether it was an individual action or not. And also elements of arousal. So this comes from the physiological measurements that you can see are sort of integrated into the timeline and into the other data types. So in this particular situation, I claim that there is a preliminary, an initial integration of different data types that can actually provide is an integrated and aligned aligned understanding of different elements of the ecology and their interaction. So this was a go-through, a very go-through through some examples, and in a sense, I use these examples as a trigger for reflection, and I invite you to reflect on what was clear and what was not clear in this, but also on what are the opportunities and obviously further challenges that we all need to engage in when doing this kind of research and engaging with the ecosystems of collaboration. So I'll return to, I'll sum up briefly. And I'm restating the position of departure in this goal. The need to approach and examine collaborative learning as an ecosystem. Viewing and examining collaborative learning in this way implies broadly an acknowledgement that it is a complex, dynamic, relational phenomenon constituting multiple elements and relationships from human biology and cognition to social and material environments. I propose also to use an ecological framework to be applied on a variety of data, which can provide the premises for translating such a view of collaborative learning into conceptual and analytical tools that can serve empirical explanation. I have done so with the conviction that ecological notions create a natural arena for significant methodological advancement in the research and practice of collaborative learning. As many empirical methods we currently use in our PhD research are often restricted to depicting the relational and situated aspect of collaborative learning, and ecological analysis, as tentatively illustrated, helps understand why and how multiple data collection techniques are necessary to unpack the different modalities of learning, from physiological processes to observable behavior, to trace collaboration in context from school to home, to street to virtual spaces, and at different time scales, from minis to school years. Ecological notions also have, I should be minding my cable. Ecological notions also have potential to expand the conceptual tool by enabling a fundamental discussion about the arrays of research paradigms and methods employed in our research on collaborative learning. Such discussion invites breathing in both the status of an ecological theory as a grand theory that aims to describe a comprehensive understanding of collaborative learning and of learning in general, but also its potential to produce a misplaced theoretical explanation. Environmental scientists, which I mentioned before, often study specific evented ecosystems to understand them and create explanations and light explanations that can inform solutions to the local environmental challenge. In a sense, the example on design-based research that I just showed is attached to the safety and educational context. Similarly, learning scientists may often need to study learning activities in specific settings, mindful of all the subjectivities and life histories involved, to understand the complexity I have been discussing throughout my talk today.
Elements of such applied localized theories and models can create bridges between the necessary detail understanding of its public collaboration and the fragmented interpretation of the process. And a very vital reflection. It may seem so, but yet I'm not proposing a grand theory of structured learning or a grand theory of everything. Typical for research in our field, it crisscrosses a broad landscape of theoretical and methodological approaches, research problems, issues, and educational situations, which often appear mutually exclusive. By proposing an economic lens as an interpretive framework, I do not advocate for theoretical effectiveness. Rather, I propose a synergistic way of thinking about theory and methods that may do better justice to the complexity of the phenomenon of cooperative learning that we are studying. In this way, these are more likely to inform action in research and interpretation. A little self-promotion here. A book is coming out in the series of New Perspectives on Learning and Instruction, where David, Giuseppe, and Espino will actually discuss this relationship between theory and method, together with 25 authors and commentators. So I invite you to perhaps take a look whether you might have the chance. So before I close, I definitely want to thank my team learn project members, and especially to Daniel Sanchez, who helped with the graphics in this presentation. The EARLI essay and EFG groups, which I'm putting together with Hani Mukundan. We will have some output and activities coming out in the next year, so that's also perhaps an interesting aspect to follow. And the current and former collaborators, there are many, and I'm grateful for all the inspirations that they provided me with throughout the years. And here is a little more, and probably more detailed and more to the point, presentations from our team. You might be interested in hearing more about learning analytics, but also Daniel will present his PhD project and other ways of presenting automated feedback. If you think about the feedback provided by the one team in nursing education, and an event symposium on multimodal analytical approaches can block the problem solving where they call criminality discuss it. And it seems that I'm done. And that is why it goes on.
Thank you, Crina, for a very stimulating presentation. I'm intrigued by this notion of the ecological unit of analysis. But elsewhere in education research, we have the notion of unit of analysis, which might be the individual, it might be in practice theory, the practice, it might be the concept. What you're presented, I'm trying to get my head around what the notion fundamentally is. And is it an a priori notion, like those earlier notions of the unit of analysis, in which you bring that into the whole study first? Or is it something derived from an analysis of the situation and an application of theory? So, in an ecological perspective, are there multiple units of analysis that you might break into any given situation?
Thank you, Daniel. That was a very stimulating question to them. I think it's also a very complicated question as well. What I'm arguing for here, and I emphasize this in this ongoing work, is that an ecological unit of analysis is, let's say, a transversal, cross-sectional view of an ecosystem. So it would, it can be several units of analysis in a collaborative situation, obviously. But in ecological unit of analysis, we would have all illustrations of all the elements and their relations operationalized in a way in which empiric analytically we could follow all, at least collect data all, and try to provide interpretations that to some level could be integrated at the end to actually understand not only the distinct elements, their presence, their intensity, their extent, or the output that this type of situation will lead to, but also how they interact
throughout the process. There is, I don't want to provide a lengthy answer, but there is obviously the challenge of what we can't study everything at the same time all the time. So this is a particular discussion that we use basically to think for around background, which elements of this, let's say, ecological interval analysis might require more attention at a certain point in time, and how to find the balance between actually addressing all these elements and their relations, yet making it an empirically feasible process, if that makes any sense.
And we have another question, Nina, please, Kyle.
Thank you, Crina, for a really, really interesting and highlighting and important presentation. I really enjoyed it. I was also intrigued by your mentee question that we didn't get back to, but now you'll have the chance because you were showing a lot of notions on your slide before. Some of them were affect, knowledge, interest, I think. No, maybe not interest, but affect and knowledge were definitely there. And you asked, you presented them as ecological notions, and you asked, have any of you been investigating these ecological notions before? And I'm pretty sure that everyone in the room would be saying, yes, one of them at least. But I didn't have it from an ecological perspective. So my question to you is, how does you were asking whether they had been investigating ecological notions. In which sense are these notions ecological? What does adding or taking your ecological perspective do to these notions? Do they change them, or do they simply mean the same? So are you actually hijacking the notions from everyone else in the room?
Thank you, Lina. That was a very typical pedagogical mistake. The question was coordinated wrongly, perhaps. Actually, I think I need to make a correction there. I didn't intend to identify those as ecological notions. I identified them as ecological elements of an ecology. And as in my initial part of the presentation, the theory part, it went very vast. I was trying to point out that, for example, theories of distributed or embodied cognition bring in cognitive notions, notions of self, or theories of motivation and self-regulation bring in notions typical to that area. And even from an ecological perspective, we need to take those elements, identify them, and try to analytically describe them as elements of the ecological interval analysis, because they are complementary and organically integrated. So if the answers to the questions were along the lines, those were ecological notions, that is my mistake. But in order to, I think it's important to make that correction. Thank you for pointing.
Thank you very much for a very stimulating presentation. I also have a difficult question for you. You answer it for more than an hour or something. But taking your nurse excerpt as an example, what you're studying, you frame as collaborative learning. And many researchers do that, but to me, learning is an emergent property of this interaction. And it's not necessarily there in the data, but it's an emergent property in the sense that it's consequential for the team or for the individuals in the future. So I would say that we're studying collaborative actions, professional actions, but learning is something slightly different, because it's an emergent property where the individuals on the team draw conclusions or have some sort of consequential reasoning or understanding that they carry with them into another situation. Would you agree to that, or am I misunderstanding?
I think it's very important that you are emphasizing that, the blurred depiction in my presentation. It's important. The question is here, and I guess I'm playing it back, emphasizing that I do agree with you, is that how do we study learning? In order to understand what brings about learning outcome or learning experience, we need to study action, activities, the concrete context in which
that learning might occur as a consequential aspect of that particular activity. So in a sense, I think that this is the way we can engage with this type of data or complexity by studying what is actually visible, or we can make visible, and make inferences in as rigorous as possible manner about what learning outcomes or learning experience might have emerged. And we have obviously standardized measures for doing that. In the case of the nursing case, or nursing education case, teachers have assessment forms and evaluative questions for the student in order to actually trigger sort of a verbalization and explication of what the students have learned. So that would be self-reported ways of assessing learning. But there is, and what I've been trying to get at during my talk and throughout my whole research career, in a sense, is to try to capture that emergent aspect of learning during the activity itself and try to make it observable.
Thank you very much for this very useful presentation. I've been working in a hospital environment for many years, and I've been through nursing training and paramedical training. This is a very impressive perspective, but it's very difficult to apply. I have to confess, because if someone wants to apply such perspectives in learning, studying, we need sources, we need money, we need technical support that here in Greece we don't have so much resources. It is very interesting to hear, but I think our teachers here in Greece can't apply such kind of research, but we would like to try it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question and comment. I think this is a case that applies to many other countries and contexts. I don't think it's singular. The type of high technology, high fidelity simulation that we've seen here is not that common. On the other hand, there are many institutes who have that. But what I've been trying to, just as a side comment in the talk, is actually to stimulate thinking about how we use theories, and we could use theories and methods in our research in a more exploratory and, as I said, synergistic way. When it comes to the materiality and the financial aspects, I think that's another discussion, perhaps in a policy penalty.
Thanks, Crina. I think people are these words stimulating a lot, and certainly has been stimulating it. And something I really like about the work is that you're trying to bring together so much, and the transversal, even the data, and we sort of talk about synergies at the end. And so I was wondering, are there any points or had in your across this sort of ecological conceptualization, have there been points where you've gone, this just isn't fitting? There are just, the synergies aren't working here, so there are disjunctions.
Yes, definitely. In the past and recently, we have this very complex project, team project at the English administration, where we see a combination of elements that, make the empirical investigation relatively, if not impossible, difficult, which makes us rethink the design and new analytical approaches, but also sometimes conceptually we see difficulties and maybe not incompatibilities, but difficulties in bringing together theoretical perspective, or theoretical ideas that we think would work very well in explaining the complex in analysis, right? But we end up in difficulties in creating the synergy and integration. So the challenge of integrated interpretations that I mentioned at the end is something that we're grappling with, and I think
both me and my colleagues are very happy to hear actually critical suggestions and comments and ideas about how other research groups have done that. But I recognize the challenge, and I think it's an important one. How you doing?
Crina, I really liked your talk. I sensed some hesitation or skepticism when you were talking about the behavioral dimension, and I liked it very much because it seems almost like a step back, but it isn't if we're doing it with this ecological perspective, and of course regarding multiple modalities. And I thought that was very inspiring. It was a bit premature actually in terms of the timing, except for 5 more minutes, but that's fine, I think, and I don't want to grill you any further. You're happy to be here. So then in that case, I take back my statement that this would have been the last question, if there is another one. Otherwise, what I'm asking that question is really how to combine these multiple modalities is then really challenging, because it's so messy and we don't really know how to make sense of so many data points, do we?
Yes, that's the $1 million question for many researchers in the fields of learning analytics and especially collaboration analytics nowadays. The practical answer is please go and listen to Rasha's talk on Friday. She will actually, in the research and the review she conducted together with several of us, she looked at different modalities, data types, and challenges in integrating, and how difficult that is, but also how wrong it can be interpreted and can be done, and that has happened in many research studies around. Now, my point about connecting to your point about behavioral, my skepticism behavioral data was not at all. I think my point there was, if I had more time, I would have elaborated on the fact that the field of learning analytics, which is has grown and it has gained great and has a lot of potential for informing at some level understandings about learning, teaching, policy making, in education decisions in education, has been framed as a study of behavior. Analytics helping host as data that shows something from behavior and learning. And I think that's the type of position that we have to challenge in a sense, because we know from previous research, extensive video research in the learning and instruction field, that behavior can be defined by different ways, and clicks in a platform being defined as behavior, but perhaps not. So I think that nuance is very important there, and calling this behavioral data widely risky approach. That's why the quotation marks on my slide. But when it comes to the integration of modalities, as I answered to the previous question, I think empirically, both technical solutions are emerging, and we see that audio data streams from multiple participants. I know we've done that kind of research, so from anyone that can be integrated, because with the newer technology, it becomes easier and easier to do that, to align, get rid of the noise in a very complex audio and video data set, and align all the inputs from different participants. So technical challenges we're overcoming them as we go. But when it comes to the interpretative aspect, that's the complicated part. And I think my talk today is basically tapping into exactly that challenge of how data on, if we take the example of the nursing, simulation nursing education, what nurse one says and does, while she's becoming actually stressed. You see levels of increasing stress because the patient is becoming critical. How that actually can be, how does that sort of information can be aligned? I think qualitatively that's possible, and that's what we are actually engaging with at the moment. We can observe and align the data at the technical level, at the analytical level, but interpretations are possible. But what we're aiming at is, and that's perhaps the talk that Daniel will provide in this talk, sort of more shed light on the matter, is how we can automate this aspect. First of all, at the level of interpretation, and secondly, in the way we present it to the students in an expression that makes sense. What you saw in the example from Monash is Monash's first attempt to provide very complex data on the timelines, but it's very noisy data. It's a lot of information. The students really understand that. And I think the moment we go that thorny challenge of how to interpret that automatically, it will become much easier to actually provide feedback, adaptive feedback in a Google dashboard or otherwise to students. Data that actually makes sense for them and for their learning process and understanding.
In spite of high and positive levels of arousals in the room, the next thing I'm going to say is going to clear the room, but don't just go right now. What I'm going to say is, since we're turning coffee into science, coffee is being served next door, next room. Just don't go just yet, because I think we all want to thank Crina very much for a wonderful talk.